At noon on March 28, 1942, a crowd gathers on the docks of Saint-Nazaire. German officers, naval ratings, curious soldiers, perhaps 360 men in all, cluster around an old British destroyer wedged into the great lock gates of the Normandie dry dock. The ship has been searched, declared harmless. Now it is a curiosity, a trophy to be photographed and picked clean of souvenirs. Somewhere in the town, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beattie sits under interrogation. A German officer is mocking him. The damage to the dock, the German says, will take only a few weeks to repair. The whole British enterprise has been a futile waste of lives. Then the world tears itself apart. 4.5 tons of high explosive, hidden in a concrete tomb behind the ship's bow, detonate with a force that obliterates everything within 200 yards. The caisson gate disintegrates. The two tankers moored in the dock are hurled aside like toys. Bodies and debris rain down across the port. When the smoke clears, the greatest dry dock on the Atlantic coast of Europe has ceased to exist. Beattie, they say, looks at his interrogator and smiles. "We're not quite as foolish as you think." This is the story of how a flotilla of small boats and one expendable destroyer sailed 400 kilometers into the heart of Nazi-occupied France, accomplished the impossible, and changed the course of the war at sea. It is the story of Operation Chariot, the Saint-Nazaire raid, the most decorated single action of the Second World War. To understand why British planners were willing to accept casualties approaching 60%, we must first understand what kept Winston Churchill awake at night in the winter of 1942. Her name was Tirpitz. At 52,000 tons fully loaded, she was the heaviest battleship ever constructed by a European navy. Her 8 15-inch guns could hurl 1,800-pound shells over 25 miles. Her belt armor was 14 inches thick. She was, in every measurable way, the most powerful surface warship in the world. And she had never fired her main guns in anger. This was precisely the point. Tirpitz was what naval strategists call a fleet in being, a weapon so powerful that its mere existence shapes the battlefield. From her anchorage in the Norwegian fjords, she cast a shadow across every convoy route in the North Atlantic. The Royal Navy was forced to keep 2 battleships, a fleet carrier, and their escorts in permanent readiness, just in case she sortied. These were ships desperately needed elsewhere, in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, protecting the convoys that kept Britain alive. Churchill called her the Beast. On January 25, 1942, he issued a directive to the chiefs of staff. The destruction or even crippling of this ship is the greatest event at sea at the present time. No other target is comparable to it. But Tirpitz would not come out to fight. She lurked in the fjords, a constant threat, tying down Allied resources through the sheer fact of her existence, unless something could be done about her only refuge. If Tirpitz were ever damaged in an Atlantic sortie, she would need a dry dock capable of handling her immense bulk, 251 meters long with a draft of 36 feet. On the entire Atlantic coast of occupied France, from the Spanish border to the tip of Brittany, there was exactly one facility that could accommodate her, the Forme Joubert at Saint-Nazaire. Built between 1929 and 1932 to service the great ocean liner Normandie, this was the largest dry dock in the world, 350 meters long, 50 meters wide. Its caisson gates alone were 51 meters across and 11 meters thick, massive steel structures that could hold back the full weight of the Atlantic. British intelligence knew what this dock meant. In May 1941, when Bismarck, Tirpitz's sister ship, was damaged in her final battle, she had been making for Saint-Nazaire when the Royal Navy caught and sank her. Without that dock, the Germans would never risk their last great battleship in Atlantic waters. The mathematics were brutally simple: destroy the dock, neutralize Tirpitz. But how? The RAF rejected bombing. The dock was surrounded by 50,000 French civilians. Precision bombing techniques in early 1942 simply did not exist. The Special Operations Executive examined the target and concluded the mission was beyond their capabilities. The weight of explosives required would need an army of agents to carry. And then someone at Combined Operations Headquarters asked an extraordinary question. What if we sailed a ship packed with explosives directly into the dock gates? The man who would champion this audacious scheme was Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, 41 years old, driven, aristocratic, utterly convinced that the war would be won by men willing to attempt the impossible. Mountbatten faced fierce opposition. The Admiralty thought the plan suicidal. The route to Saint-Nazaire ran 8 kilometers up the Loire estuary, past heavy coastal batteries, through waters too shallow for a destroyer at low tide. Every commander who examined the charts reached the same conclusion. Any ship attempting to reach the dock would be blown out of the water long before she got there. But Mountbatten had found a loophole. An exceptional spring tide was expected in late March 1942, high enough to allow a lightened destroyer to pass over the sandbanks that guarded the estuary. A ship stripped of everything unnecessary, riding high in the water, might just make it through. The planning accelerated. Intelligence flooded in from every source. MI6 agents provided street maps of Saint-Nazaire. Naval intelligence compiled harbor defenses. Pre-war technical journals revealed the engineering specifications of the dock mechanisms. Enigma intercepts delivered the German recognition signals that might buy precious minutes of confusion. On March 3, 1942, the operation was approved. The planners gave it a name, Chariot. Now they needed a ship to sacrifice. She was called USS Buchanan when she was launched at Bath Iron Works, Maine in January 1919, a Wickes-class destroyer, already obsolescent when she entered service. In September 1940, she was one of 50 old American destroyers traded to Britain in exchange for bases in the Caribbean. Renamed HMS Campbeltown, she had spent 18 months on unglamorous convoy duty. Now she would become the most dangerous ship in the Royal Navy. The conversion took 10 days. Workers cut away her rear funnels and raked the remaining 2 at an angle, transforming her silhouette to resemble a German Moa-class torpedo boat. They stripped out her torpedo tubes, her depth charges, her boats, everything that added weight. In their place went 8 Oerlikon cannons and armored plating to protect the commandos who would ride her decks. But the real work happened deep in her bow. Lieutenant Nigel Tirpitz, a 28-year-old explosives expert from HMS Vernon, designed a compartment of steel and concrete immediately behind the ship's collision bulkhead. Into this tomb went 24 Mark 7 depth charges, 4.5 tons of Amatol high explosive. Tirpitz calculated that the buckling from ramming the dock gates would not reach the charges. The bow would crumple, the explosives would remain intact. For the detonators, Tirpitz devised a system of redundant fuses, primary 8-hour acid delays, backup pencil detonators, all connected by Cortex detonating cord and cemented in place to prevent tampering. The charges were set before entering the estuary. After that, nothing could stop them. Campbeltown had become a floating bomb. Her crew would have approximately 8 hours to complete their mission and escape before she destroyed herself and everything around her. On March 13th, the raiding force assembled at Falmouth. They were an extraordinary collection, 346 naval personnel to crew the ships, and 265 commandos to storm the dock installations. The commandos came primarily from No. 2 Commando, led by Lieutenant-Colonel Charles Newman, a 37-year-old building contractor with 17 years of territorial service, a broken nose, prominent ears, and what one officer described as the appearance of a kindly elephant. His men would soon discover that this gentle exterior concealed an iron will. The naval force would be commanded by Commander Robert Ryder, known as Red for his hair and his temper. At 34, Ryder had already survived being torpedoed and spending 4 days adrift in the Atlantic. He would lead from motor gun boat 314, navigating the flotilla up the estuary using the only radar set in the force. Campbeltown herself would be commanded by Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beattie, 33 years old, calm, methodical, about to earn his place in history. The force would travel in 18 small craft, 16 Fairmile motor launches, 1 motor gunboat, and 1 motor torpedo boat. These were wooden vessels, barely over 100 feet long, armored only with optimism. Their job was to land the commandos, embark the survivors, and somehow make it home. Against them stood 5,000 German troops, 28 coastal guns, 43 anti-aircraft weapons, and an enemy convinced that what the British were about to attempt was impossible. At 2 o'clock on the afternoon of March 26, 1942, the flotilla slipped out of Falmouth Harbor. The weather was calm, the sky clear. The commandos sprawled on the decks of the motor launches, playing cards, sleeping, trying not to think about what lay ahead. For 30 hours, the four sailed southwest into the Atlantic, then turned east toward the coast of France. At 10 o'clock on the night of the 27th, they raised the German naval ensign and formed into the arrowhead formation that would take them up the Loire. The submarine HMS Sturgeon was waiting at the mouth of the estuary, her conning tower serving as a navigation beacon. One by one, the small boats passed her and entered the shallow waters that led to Saint-Nazaire. Campbeltown scraped bottom twice. Each time, heart stopped, and each time she pulled free and continued on. The tide was high. The calculations had been correct. For 1 hour and 22 minutes, they sailed past German positions in the darkness. Searchlights swept the water but did not linger. The shore batteries remained silent. Then, at 1:22, a signal lamp blinked from the northern shore. Challenge. On motor gunboat. 314, a signalman named Pike began transmitting the German recognition codes obtained from Enigma. The shore station hesitated. In that hesitation lay everything. Pike sent another signal. 2 craft damaged by enemy action. Request permission to proceed to harbor without delay. More hesitation. In the darkness, Campbeltown drove forward at 18 knots. Astern, the motor launches followed in 2 columns, the commandos crouching behind their thin steel shields. A second challenge came, more urgent this time. Pike replied with variations on the codes. The shore station accepted them. At 1:28, 6 minutes after the first challenge, the deception collapsed. Every searchlight on both banks of the estuary blazed to life, and the German guns opened fire. Beattie gave the order. The German ensign came down. The white ensign rose in its place. Campbeltown surged to full speed. She had 1 mile to go. What followed defies adequate description. Every gun in Saint-Nazaire that could bear on the estuary was now firing at the small flotilla. Tracer rounds turned the night incandescent. Shells churned the water into foam. On Campbeltown's bridge, men died and were replaced at the wheel within seconds. Beattie stood in the open, utterly exposed, calling course corrections to his helmsman. A shell killed the first helmsman. His replacement was wounded almost immediately. Lieutenant Tirpitz, the man who had designed the explosives, seized the wheel and guided the ship through the final approach. Behind Campbeltown, the motor launches were being slaughtered. Wooden hulls designed to carry holidaymakers shattered under direct hits. Men burned, men drowned, ammunition cooked off in spectacular secondary explosions. Of the 16 launches, only 4 would survive the night, but Campbeltown drove on. At 01:34, 4 minutes late, an eternity in such circumstances, her bow struck the great caisson of the Normandie dock. 36 feet of her hull crumpled like paper. She rode up onto the gate and came to rest with her bridge level with the top of the lock. Beattie's voice carried across the chaos. Well, there we are. Even as Campbeltown struck, the commandos were swarming over her sides. They had 18 minutes to destroy the installations that allowed the dock to function, the pumping stations, the winding houses, the mechanisms that controlled the gates. 18 minutes before the German reinforcements would overwhelm them. They moved with the precision of surgeons. Lieutenant Stuart Chant led his demolition team 40 feet underground into the main pump house. He had been wounded in the leg during the approach and was hit again as he descended, shrapnel tearing into his knee, his arm, both hands. He planted his charges anyway, 90 pounds of explosives among the massive impeller pumps that drained the dock. The fuses were set for 90 seconds. Chant hobbled up the stairs, bleeding from half a dozen wounds. He was barely clear when the building erupted. Similar scenes played out across the dock. Lieutenant Corin Purdon's team destroyed the northern winding house. Lieutenant Christopher Smalley obliterated the southern winding shed. Sergeant Carr, taking over after Lieutenant Burtonshaw was mortally wounded, placed the charges that damaged the northern caisson. In 15 minutes, the commandos had accomplished everything they came to do. The pumping machinery was wrecked, the winding gear was destroyed, and Campbeltown sat embedded in the main dock gates, her hidden charges ticking toward detonation. Now they had to get out. Colonel Newman had established his headquarters near the Old Mole, coordinating the assault by signal lamp and runner. As the demolition teams reported their successes, he faced an impossible situation. The motor launches that were supposed to evacuate his men had been destroyed or driven off. Of the 16 craft that entered the estuary, only a handful remained operational. There were simply not enough boats to take everyone home. Newman gathered his surviving commandos, perhaps 100 men out of the original 265, and delivered the news with characteristic understatement. "Well, chaps, we've missed the boat home. We'll have to walk." The only route out of the dock area was across a narrow iron bridge swept by German machine guns. Between Newman's force and open country lay 5,000 enemy troops who were very much awake. A German grenade burst at Newman's feet. Shrapnel tore into his legs. He did not fall. He turned to Major Bill Copeland, his second-in-command. "Shall we call it a day?" Copeland's reply has passed into legend. "Certainly not, Colonel. We'll fight our way out." Newman nodded. "Away you go, lads," and they charged. While Newman's commandos fought through the streets of Saint-Nazaire, one of the most extraordinary actions of the entire raid was playing out on the waters of the estuary. Motor Launch 306 had failed to land her troops and was attempting to withdraw when she encountered a force of 5 German vessels, including the destroyer Jaguar. A collision seemed inevitable. Lieutenant Henderson threw the wheel hard over, scraping past the German ship at a distance of barely 50 yards. At that range, Jaguar's guns could not miss. Sergeant Thomas Frank Durant of No. 1 Commando was manning a Lewis gun on the launch's stern, a World War I weapon hand-loaded with no gun shield. He had already been wounded in the arm-engaging shore positions during the approach. Now, as the German destroyer poured fire into the wooden launch, he turned his obsolete weapon on the enemy by bridge. The German commander called on the British to surrender. Durant's answer was a burst of fire. Jaguar closed in. Her shells smashed the launch to splinters. Durant was hit again and again and again, in the chest, the stomach, the head. He kept firing. He could no longer stand. He supported himself by clinging to the gun mounting. Still he fired. When the Germans finally came alongside to accept the launch's surrender, Durant collapsed at his gun. The surgeon who examined him counted 27 bullet wounds. He died the next day in a German military hospital. But his courage had so impressed Capitaine Lieutenant Paul, the commander of Jaguar, that Paul sought out Colonel Newman in the POW camp weeks later. "You may wish to recommend this man for a high decoration," the German officer said. "His bravery was beyond anything I have ever seen." Thomas Durant became one of only 3 men in history to receive the Victoria Cross on the recommendation of an enemy officer. By dawn on March 28th, the fighting had ended. The surviving commandos, exhausted, out of ammunition, many of them wounded, had been rounded up by German patrols. 5 men would eventually escape overland through Spain. The rest faced years of captivity. The Germans now turned their attention to the strange British ship wedged into their dock gates. Throughout the morning, soldiers and sailors swarmed over Campbeltown, searching for intelligence, stripping her of souvenirs. Rumors spread that she contained chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, the luxuries that German troops craved. Senior officers arrived to inspect this peculiar trophy. By mid-morning, several hundred men were on or around the ship. A demolition team had examined her and found nothing suspicious. The explosives, sealed in their concrete tomb, remained hidden. At 10:35, some sources say noon exactly, the acid in Nigel Tirpitz's fuses finally ate through the last barrier. The blast killed every man on the ship and around it. The caisson gate, 51 meters of reinforced steel, simply ceased to exist. The 2 tankers moored in the dock were thrown about like bath toys. The shockwave shattered windows half a mile away. When the smoke cleared, the Normandie dry dock was gone. The German garrison at Saint-Nazaire had been badly shaken by the dawn assault. The explosion of Campbeltown pushed them over the edge into panic. 2 days later, at 4:30 in the afternoon of March 30th, the delayed action torpedoes fired by motor torpedo boat 74 during the initial assault finally detonated, destroying the lock gates to the inner basin. The Germans, convinced that another commando attack was underway, opened fire on everything that moved. Organization Todd workers in khaki uniforms fleeing the dock area were mistaken for British soldiers. German sentries cut them down by the dozen. French civilians were caught in the crossfire. By some estimates, 250 workers and bystanders died in the friendly fire panic that followed. The harbor was closed for the rest of the week while demolition teams searched for more hidden explosives. They found none, but by then the damage was done. The numbers tell a story of sacrifice almost beyond comprehension. Of the 612 men who sailed from Falmouth, 169 were killed. 105 naval personnel and 64 commandos. 215 were taken prisoner, only 228 returned to England, many of them wounded. The casualty rate approached 60%. The motor launches had been virtually annihilated. Of 16 boats, only 4 made it home. The rest burned, sank, or were captured in the murderous waters of the Loire. And yet every major objective had been achieved. The pumping stations were destroyed. The winding gear was wrecked. The caisson gate was obliterated. The Normandie dock would not function again until 1948, 3 years after the war ended. The first vessel to use the repaired facility was, with bitter irony, the former German liner Europa, given to France as compensation for the loss of the original Normandie. In the weeks following the raid, a subtle change rippled through German naval planning. The Kriegsmarine had lost its only Atlantic refuge for heavy units. Tirpitz, the beast in the fjords, was now truly trapped. She would never enter the Atlantic. For the remaining 2.5 years of her existence, Tirpitz lurked in Norwegian waters, a diminishing threat, the subject of repeated RAF attacks until Lancaster bombers finally destroyed her with 12,000-pound tallboy bombs in November 1944. She capsized and sank with the loss of 1,000 men, but she had never fulfilled her purpose, never broken out to ravage the convoys, never forced the decisive battle her designers had intended. The men of Operation Chariot had seen to that. When the recommendations for honors were compiled, the staff at Combined Operations faced an unusual problem. So many acts of extraordinary courage had occurred in a single night that the normal allocation of decorations seemed inadequate. Beyond the Victoria Crosses, 84 additional decorations were awarded, a total of 89 honors for a force of just over 600 men. No operation of comparable duration has ever been so heavily decorated. In the years that followed, the survivors gathered each year to remember their comrades. They called themselves the Saint-Nazaire Society, and they kept alive the memory of what had been accomplished in those few terrible hours. Lord Mountbatten, who had championed the operation against the doubters, said of Chariot, "Of all the operations I was involved in during the war, it is without doubt the raid on Saint-Nazaire with which I am most proud to have been associated. It was one of those enterprises which could only be attempted because it seemed in the eyes of the enemy to be absolutely impossible." The Germans themselves were forced to agree. Before the raid, U-boat commander Herbert Solar had assured Admiral Dönitz that a commando attack on Saint-Nazaire would be hazardous and highly improbable. After the raid, Hitler sacked his chief of staff for the Western Theater and ordered the immediate fortification of the Atlantic coast. By August 1942, 15,000 concrete bunkers were under construction from Norway to Spain, resources diverted from the Eastern Front, from the U-boat war, from the Luftwaffe. A single night's work by 600 men had reshaped German strategy for the remainder of the war. Today, at the Prince of Wales Pier in Falmouth, a memorial bears the names of the 168 men who did not return. At La Baule-Escoublac, near Saint-Nazaire, a cemetery holds those who fell on foreign soil. The Normandie dock itself still stands, rebuilt, functional, a working piece of French maritime infrastructure that gives no sign of its violent history. But the story of Operation Chariot is not really about docks or ships or strategic calculations. It is about what human beings are capable of when they believe in something larger than themselves. It is about Stuart Chant, wounded 4 times, planting his explosives in darkness 40 feet underground. It is about Thomas Durant, holding his gun with 27 bullets in his body. It is about Charles Newman, shrapnel in his legs, leading a charge across an impossible bridge. It is about Stephen Beattie standing calm in the inferno, steering his ship into history. They went knowing the odds. They went knowing that many would not return. They went because the dock at Saint-Nazaire had to be destroyed, and there was no other way to do it. They called it the greatest raid of all. They were right.